Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I think I will start as people continue to join. I have the pleasure of moderating today's event. I'm Olivia Rope, the Executive Director of Penal Reform International. This event takes place on the sidelines of the UN Commission on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice, known as the Crime Commission, that takes place annually in May in Vienna. Some events are online, like this one, so we'll be joined by delegates at the Commission and others, I hope. The event will be recorded and will be made available on our website, YouTube channel and social media sites if you want to listen back or share with others. We hope to have a couple of questions, but with such a extensive panel, I do encourage you to put questions and comments in the Q&A or the chat, so that you can have some answers while we go through the panel as well. I would like to thank the co-sponsors of this event, namely the Government of Liechtenstein, Correctional Service Canada, Justice and Correction Service at the UN Department of Peace Operations, American Civil Liberties Union, Prison Insider, and the International Penal and Penitentiary Foundation. Today we meet as many prison systems globally are facing multiple and overlapping crises. There are emerging and worsening conflicts. We have disasters as a result of climate change, and we have the continuing impacts, of course, of the COVID-19 pandemic. We've organised this event today to give some time to share and shed light on the plight of people who are in prison when these or a combination of these disasters are at play. We only have a short time, so I'll turn right away to our opening remarks, and I'm really pleased to introduce Robert Pulver, who is the Chief of Justice and Correction Service at the Office of Rule of Law and Security Institutions within the UN Department of Peace Operations. Thank you so much, Robert, for joining at such an early hour. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Olivia, and I would like to sincerely and deeply thank PRI and the co-sponsors, including Liechtenstein and Canada, for inclusion and for this event. It's my pleasure to open this event on the effect of conflict, COVID-19, and climate change on prisons. I want to take this opportunity to highlight the seriousness of this triple threat and emphasize the importance of our continued engagement working together on corrections. Safe, secure, and humane prisons are essential to peace and security, which fits within our work as the Department of Peace Operations. Without secure prisons, civilians are not safe from those who have committed serious crimes, including crimes that fuel conflict. Our peacekeepers are also not safe if there are no safe, secure, and humane prisons for those who threaten troops on the ground. Not surprisingly, prison challenges may be particularly acute in conflict, post-conflict, and other crisis settings, leading to security breaches with effects that go far beyond prison walls. This includes prison riots, mass escapes, and serious human rights violations. In many countries affected by conflict, prison facilities are overcrowded and prison systems are overstretched due to lack of resources, systemic neglect, insufficient and ill-trained staff, poor living conditions, and inadequate sanitation and health services. Such conditions have profound implications for upholding security and human rights. The COVID pandemic poses risks to places of detention, as we all know, especially in conflict affected settings. The pandemic has required fast and coordinated responses. Prison overcrowding increases the challenges of COVID-19 and hampers the ability to introduce effective means to control and prevent the spread. Undoubtedly, prisons are high-risk environments for COVID-19 and other diseases, also increasing the risk to prison officers, healthcare professionals, and others working in prisons. Similarly, global warming will continue to have a profound impact on prisons. Climate change undermines food security and negatively impacts the security situation in fragile settings affected by conflict. This further increases competition over resources, strains state finances, and intensifies existing political tensions. Food shortages, financial cuts, and increased prison populations will have severe implications for the security and safety of both inmates and prisons officers. And as we all know, when state finances are pressed, prisons are the first to be cut and the last to be seeing funding increases. As this triple crisis has shown us, there is now more than ever an urgent need to rethink the use of imprisonment and avoid the over-reliance on and inappropriate use of incarceration. The deprivation of liberty should be used only as the last resort. The United Nations supports holistic prison reform. The Department of Peace Operations, working with other UN entities and civil society organizations. And in this context, I would also like to mention UNODC and their important role as one of the main partners, given that we're at the Crime Convention today. But working with others to provide guidance and operational tools to national prison services to prevent and control infections, ensure continued adherence to minimum prison standards, and promote the use of alternatives to imprisonment. The UN Common Position on Incarceration promotes the reduction of the scope and use of imprisonment through alternatives to imprisonment, sentencing policies, and more. Finally, we are strengthening the emphasis on peacekeeping's responsive and preventative functions, working to ensure adequate support as we adapt to the changes the world is facing. Here, our common agenda, as announced by the Secretary General, proposes a path forward adapted to the challenges of today and complemented by a new global deal, giving improved response to crisis a central role and ensuring to leave no one behind. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robert, for very succinctly explaining the impacts of this triple threat, which I really like the way you've coined that, and talking about working together. I think it's also good to reiterate that together we all need to ensure that prisons remain, or increasingly so, are integrated into peacekeeping missions and so on, given that we know they're really a requisite, effective prison systems are a requisite for achieving a functioning justice system and sustainable peace. So PRI stands ready, of course, to continue our work together in that respect. Our Global Prison Trends report for 2022 that we published last week looked at the impacts on prisoners from conflict, which is on the increase globally. And of course, at the forefront of many of our minds at the moment is Ukraine. And so I'm very happy here today that we have Dmytro Yagunov, who is a lawyer and also the Ukrainian member of the European Committee for the Prevention of Torture, the CPT. So thank you, Dmytro, for joining us today, and the floor is yours to share your insights on what's happening for people in prison in Ukraine at the moment. Oh, you're on mute, you're on mute.
Okay. Sorry about this. Dear colleagues, I am very grateful to organizers and participants of this important event for this invitation and possibility to present some views on the contemporary state of the Ukrainian prison system, which without any doubt is in the state of the deepest crisis for all history of the Ukrainian independence for the last 30 years. For a long period, Ukraine has been traditionally famous, in the negative sense, of this meaning for one of the biggest prison population in Europe and one of the highest incarceration rates in the world. For the last 10 years, the Ukrainian prison population significantly dropped, decreased. Nevertheless, before the war started in Ukraine 3 months ago, about 48 prisoners were held in Ukrainian prison institutions of all types. And in the first 3 months of the war that we are having at the moment, there were 33 prisons located in the combat zone, which were affected with military actions. There were examples when missiles aimed at buildings of prison institutions, which led to several escapes of prisoners. And unfortunately, the Ukrainian prison government was not ready to face the military aggression of the Russian Federation for 100%. And consequently, this unpreparedness led to many legal, social, logistic, and other problems, both for prisoners and prison staff. For example, unexpected and badly organized evacuation of prisoners from facilities on the front line or near the front line or to the central Ukraine led to additional tensions between prisoners and prison officers in the aspect of their right to private family life. I mean, first of all, additional searches, additional measures of control and security, prohibition of family contacts, and other restrictions. In its turn, violation of right to family, private and family life is very close to torture and other forms of ill treatment in the period of wartime. But I'd like to maybe stress one very important thing from my point of view. From the strategic point of view, the main negative consequence of the war for the Ukrainian prison system was a change of focus from rehabilitation to control and security. Unfortunately, this process is taking place in the moment, and it's very pity because Ukrainian authorities have been shaping the rehabilitative basis of the Ukrainian prison system for the last 30 years due to support of different international actors like Council of Europe, like European Union, governments of many states, including Canada, Norway, the UK, and other international NGOs. And unfortunately, all this rehabilitative basis of the Ukrainian prison system was seriously damaged with the war, and because all connections between public bodies, international actors, NGOs, both international and national, were destroyed in the aspect of cooperation on issues of offender rehabilitation. But maybe the most urgent issue that is taking place with the Ukrainian prison system is a phenomenon of mass torture that quite common on the occupied territories by Russian military forces. As far as prison under occupation are concerned, there is much evidence of mass practices of torture in the Ukrainian prison located on the territories under the control of the Russian military forces. And honestly speaking, the scenario was mostly the same in every case. The Ukrainian prison officers, and I'd like to stress special attention on such a problem, are demanded by Russian military forces to cooperate and collaborate with the Russian occupation regime. And for example, on the not so long ago, just 1 week ago, on the 11th of May, the Russian military forces forcibly captured one pretrial prison on the south of Ukraine in the city of Kherson. And according to different data, there was using of light and noise grenades and shooting of prisoners, and as well as taking away the prison officers in unknown directions. And nowadays, the most maybe urgent problem of the Ukrainian prison system, if you're talking about occupied territories and captured prison institutions on the south and east of Ukraine, is that Ukrainian prison officers who did not agree to collaborate with the Russians are arrested, tortured, and sometimes taken away in unknown directions. I even had a personal experience when I was asked in informal way by relatives of several captured Ukrainian prison officers to attract attention to them and make some posts on the web. But later I was asked immediately to remove all my posts because of the real danger for their lives and health, because they were in prisons, illegal prisons on Russian territories. In contrast, the Ukrainian prison officers who agreed to collaborate with Russians and Russian occupation regime are declared as criminal and charged with treason by the Ukrainian authorities. Now, therefore, this situation makes very difficult the factual status of the Ukrainian prison officers at the moment under occupation. In fact, the Ukrainian authorities create a trap for the Ukrainian prison officers, which could not be solved at the moment. It's obvious that Russian occupation regime is trying to use their Ukrainian prisons as the places for keeping those Ukrainian civilians who don't support the occupation regime. The Ukrainian prisons are also used for temporary keeping of captured military officers, as well as for keeping the Ukrainian prison officers who did not agree to collaborate with Russians. There were some events in captured prisons when Russian occupants shot Ukrainian prisoners with the aim to suppress any form of resistance and create the atmosphere of fear in prisons. From the managerial point of view, some days ago, Ukrainian prison administration decided to suspend powers of all Ukrainian prison officers who serve in prison located on the occupied territories of Ukraine. I can hardly comment such a strange governmental decision, but such temporary abolition of powers of the Ukrainian prison officers was not supported with the suspension of execution of punishment for prisoners. In other words, the Ukrainian prison officers on the occupied territories were left without powers, financial support, and salaries. Accordingly, prisoners were left without legitimate prison officers and guards, and as a result, without proper security and control. At the same time, most Ukrainian prison officers, according to different informal sources that I received, continue to fulfill their responsibilities and obligations without, as I said before, without salary and formal powers, because prison officers try doing at least something in these terrible circumstances with control and security under the occupation regime in Ukraine. So in general, we have particularly such sometimes strange, sometimes difficult, sometimes very difficult situation concerned with occupation regime of Ukraine, or particular some territories of Ukraine, where all problems of the Ukrainian prison system could be divided maybe in two parts for prisons under the control of Ukrainian government and prisons under the control of Russian occupation regime. But generally speaking, and making some maybe global conclusion, the consequences of this war for Ukraine will be seen much later, after the war will end. As I said before, we will see a serious decline in rehabilitative potential of Ukrainian prison system after the war, and this global and strategic problem will be the most important, the most urgent for the future after the war will end. I hope in the nearest future. And finally, maybe I'd like to express my final remark. The war, unfortunately, takes all attention of administrators, prison officers, prisoners and their relatives from other problems. So any issues concerned with pandemic situation, with coronavirus and other similar issues were left, it's obvious, without proper governmental control, and this problem is also sharp at the moment. With your permission, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention again, for this invitation to participate in this brilliant event. And if you have any question, I will be happy to answer them. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dimitro. It's quite overwhelming listening to the complex problems that Ukrainian prisons are facing in the conflict zone and not in the conflict zone. And I really wish you all the best for the important work that you're doing on a daily basis. And I hope both in the immediate terms and also longer term that Ukraine can be supported to make sure that all the wins and gains that the prison service have made over the last couple of decades are not completely lost. We have a brief policy briefing that Edith will share in the chat, which looks at how prisons and criminal justice systems in fragile and conflict affected states are affected, and also it gives 10 recommendations for restoring peace and rule of law by building effective criminal justice systems. So I hope that will also be useful to you and participants here today. Now I turn to our next speaker, Kathy Alvarez, who's the Executive Director of Street Law Philippines. She's a human rights lawyer and does some incredible work on access to justice for vulnerable sectors, and particularly looks at law reform around humane drug policies in the Philippines. We've invited Kathy today because the Philippines is one of the most natural hazard prone countries in the world. And we want to hear about how prisons and people in prison have been impacted by the recent typhoons in the Philippines. Kathy, please go ahead.
Thank you, Olivia. Thank you, everyone. I'd like to share my screen. Apologies for the background noise. I hope you don't hear too much of it. Anyway. So I'm not an expert on disaster risk reduction management. So this will be from the perspective of access to justice. So in the Philippines also has the reputation of being one of the most having the most overcrowded prisons in the world. And we have a penitentiary system which is fragmented. We have separate system for pre-trial detainees, and they are housed in facilities that are referred to as jails, as well as those who are convicted of crimes punishable by imprisonment of below 3 years. And then there is a separate set of facilities for those who are convicted of crimes that are punishable by above 3 years, and they are what we refer to here in the Philippines as prisons. Of course, this does not even include all of those people who have been arrested and detained in police stations, and that's another problem as well. So the jails here, they are managed by the Bureau of Jail Management and Penology, or BJMP, and they are under the Department of Interior and Local Government. But there's also a separate kind of detention facility called provincial jails, which are managed by local governments. So you can see how confusing it can get, right? And then the prisons where those who have their cases have already been decided, they are under the jurisdiction of the Bureau of Corrections under the Department of Justice. And so all of these different government agencies, the policies are not always the same. So sometimes there's some confusion after someone has been convicted and they have to transfer from a BJMP facility to a Bureau of Corrections facility. So these are some of the issues that we deal with. So as of May 2021, our jail and prison population was at over 165,000, with 64% in pre-trial detention, and 10% are women. Actually, the 64% is already an improvement, because from the previous years it went as high as 75%. And then the BJMP manages around over 400 city, district, municipal jails all over the Philippines, and the average congestion rate is 348%, while the Bureau of Corrections manages the national prisons with an average congestion rate of 403%. I just need to point out that this is the national average. And there are specific facilities where the congestion rates could go as high as over 1,000%, depending on the size of the facility in a particular city. For instance, I work in Cebu, which is in the central Philippines. Some of our detention facilities are supposed to only house over 100 people, but they now, because of the war on drugs and the increased, the in very, very high rates of arrest, some of the facilities have over 1,000% congestion. And so, add to this the location of the Philippines, where we are very prone to natural disasters. We are in the Pacific Ring of Fire. We have a lot of earthquakes. And as you may have heard, the super typhoons uh, almost always pass by one of our islands. And so we're an archipelago. And so the different detention facilities are also divided, surrounded by water, right? Okay. So just to share, just last December, we had a super typhoon here in my city. Um, and we didn't have electricity for over a month. My internet connection was actually just recently restored, and just before I signed into this Zoom, it got disconnected again, and I had to use a prepaid internet. But imagine no electricity, no electric fans in a facility where people are crowded, you know, as high as 1,000% congestion rate, and and uh, and since the pandemic started and we had a lockdown in the Philippines from March 2020, our jails and prisons have also been on total lockdown, which means that families are not allowed to visit. And as of my last paralegal training with some jail officials in my city last month, visitation still hasn't been restored. So our persons deprived of liberty have not really seen their families face to face since March 2020. And as a result of the typhoon, where there was no power and therefore no internet connection, even the online visitation facility was also suspended. What does this mean? This also means that they do not have a chance to talk to their lawyers, because it's the families themselves who also do the following up of cases. So it's normal for us to hear when we do the online jail visits, where our paralegal aides, the persons deprived of liberty that we provide paralegal trainings for, always want to ask help following up of their cases, because they don't know when the next hearing will be set. So this was just into 2021. One of the more dangerous typhoons to have passed through the Philippines was Typhoon Haiyan in November 2013. But months later, there was actually a jailbreak in one of in the area that was mostly hit. Leyte lost around 8,000 people due to this typhoon. And in January the following year, there was a jailbreak because the persons in the detention facilities were complaining that they didn't have enough food. And I will go into why later. So these are just some of the effects of natural disasters. But last year, right before the pandemic happened, the Bureau of Jail Management and Penology came out with a memorandum circular mainstreaming disaster risk reduction and management for all of their BJMP jails all over the Philippines. It was supposed to take effect January 21, 2020. I was looking for a version from the Bureau of Corrections, because remember, the Bureau of Corrections, they manage the prisons. The BJMP, they manage the pretrial detainees. So I was looking for a version of this for the prisons, but I couldn't find any. So I'm assuming that they don't have something like this yet. Now, what does this memorandum circular say with respect to the response of jail management when it comes to natural hazards and disasters? So some of the key features is the creation of national, local, and jail committees for disaster risk reduction and management. So they're supposed to form some kind of council within the structure of the BJMP. The jail wardens are designated also as the focal persons for disaster risk reduction and management.
Kathy, just
And
1 minute, sorry to
Yeah.
interrupt.
it's almost my last slide. Thank you, Olivia. And persons deprived of liberty are also assigned as coordinators, and they're supposed to submit their action plans. But this was before the lockdown in March 2020, so I still have yet to see if this has really been implemented at all. So what are some of the challenges? Of course, the overcongestion of our detention facilities. And then there's an insufficient number of jail personnel and the designation of multiple roles. For instance, when a jail personnel is assigned as a paralegal officer, they also have to work as prison guards or as escorts during hearings because there's not enough personnel to manage all of the people who are in detention. It's just too many. The goal for each jail is for every 500 person deprived of liberty, there should be one jail paralegal officer. But even that is already like, how can you manage 500 cases if you're just one person? And they're not even able to do that. Often it's like one jail paralegal officer for thousands of detainees. And then they would be added, they would have the roles also of disaster risk and reduction officers. The locations of jails and prisons in the Philippines are, because of the stigma associated with being in detention, they're often away from the main, from the centers. In Cebu, for instance, our jails are in the mountain barangays, so they're not really easy to reach. So imagine the implications when there's a need for rescue operations. They are always the least priority. And because of this stigma and discrimination against persons deprived of liberty, I've heard some local officials say that, why should I spend money for people who are in detention? They are criminals. So you can just imagine how they are not really seen as a group that needs to be given time and assistance if they need assistance, if they need rescuing during natural disasters. And of course, all of these things are a result of overcriminalization. You would be hard-pressed to find a law in the Philippines that does not impose imprisonment as a penalty. Even something like gambling outside, you would be sent to jail. And so all of these things, all of these factors contribute to perhaps a perfect storm. I'm just hoping that in the years to come, climate justice will become a priority for my country. And all of the sectors, all of the vulnerable communities, including persons deprived of liberty, will not be left behind. Thank you, Olivia, and I apologize if I went over.
Thank you, Kathy. And just exactly what you say around prisons not really being included in disaster risk reduction, or at least in many countries there isn't even the policy like you have in the Philippines, which is a great leap forward. We have published, with the support of Liechtenstein, a guide specifically for prison management and government agencies to plan and respond to natural disasters in terms of prisons. So we hope that that can also spark some action. And we used, of course, the Philippines as a case study in that guide. So a lot of what you said sounded familiar, but I think that the real human stories and the impact on people not being able to see family, even online, because of the super typhoon is something that really stuck in my mind from your remarks. So thank you. Now we turn to the other crisis that the world is dealing with, and of course that's the coronavirus pandemic. As in the Philippines and many other countries, prison systems were really at crisis point when the pandemic hit, in terms of overcrowding and underfunded prison health systems in particular. We have been sort of assessing how justice systems and how prison systems responded. And one thing that has come out of our assessment is that systems with good governance, with things like participatory processes and already established coordination amongst probation, prison, the court system and so on, were able to respond in a more efficient, effective way. And we did look specifically at Kenya in regard to our guidance and analysis around how good governance impacted COVID responses in the justice sector. So that is why we have invited Dr. Christantis Mekako, who's the Senior Superintendent of Prisons and Personal Assistant to the Commissioner General of the Kenya Prison Service, to share their experiences in Kenya in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you, Chris. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Olivia. Thank you, everybody. Actually, it's a great honor for Kenya to be invited to share our story in regard to how we dealt with COVID and how we are still dealing with it because it's still here with us. And I would wish to go through some few slides, just indicating where we are with the COVID and some of the lessons that we've drawn out of it, and maybe also discussing the way forward. Okay, thank you. Yeah, and also discuss the way forward. So I start by giving some small statistics there, that up to today, we've had 11,482 cases within the prisons, which makes up about 10.43% of our prison population. And of these, 9,485 are male and 1,987 are female. In terms of death, we've had 36 deaths, including 19 members of staff and 17 inmates. How did we manage, or how were we managing? Initially, when COVID struck, we conducted a very rapid needs assessment together with the Kenya Red Cross Society and the ICRC, and designed some adequate responses to curb the menace. Actually, I would say that we didn't quite perform miracles in this. We just tried to customize the protocols to suit the prison environment, which was to screen, quarantine, and test, especially those ones who are coming in for the first time. And to be able to do this, management decided to identify 44 prisons which were prepared as quarantine and isolation centers, meaning all new arrivals, would be taken there, they are screened, and then once they are seen not to be infected, then they'll be allowed to join the rest. Of course, just following the normal protocols of hygiene, sanitization, masking, and then the medics using the PPEs. Of course, not failing to mention that we really had some challenges, especially when it came to provision of PPEs because of issues of funding. And then, as it has already been pointed out, prisons in many places are overcrowded. Kenya is not a unique case, and so we also face challenges of overcrowding. And therefore, we benefited from a presidential directive. His Excellency, the President of the Republic of Kenya, gave an order restricting movement of people throughout the country, and of course also restricted movement in and out of the prisons. And as a measure to contain the congestion in the prisons, he gave an order, and we set a criteria through which 4,000 petty offenders were released from the prison, just to make sure that we have some space, especially for quarantine, for isolation and all that. And then because there was a very restricted movement of people, we embarked on using virtual courts because, justice needed to continue. people needed to go to court and, justice was to be dispensed. And so we started using virtual courts. And then, of course, we suspended prisoners' visitation. Instead of prisoners being visited, we were using telephones so that prisoners were given telephones to speak to their family members, at least to keep in touch with the families without physically meeting. Of course, with so many challenges, you can imagine a prison with 1,000+ people, and they need to have telephones to speak to their people. It was not very easy. It means that that link between the prison and the community was curtailed. Then, of course, we had so many trainings on COVID protocols, informing prisoners on what they're supposed to do to prevent infection, informing members of staff on what they're supposed to do to prevent infections. And then, of course, once the vaccines came, we quickly embraced them, and we are doing very well in terms of acceptance, as you can see on the slides. We have 88.5 members of staff who've taken the vaccine, and 94.5% of the inmates have taken the vaccine as of now. The challenges, like I've already mentioned before, the issue of congestion, and therefore it was very challenging to practice things like social distancing, and then the shortage of PPEs, just like it was even in other places within the country and maybe all over the world, and also inadequate medical supply whenever they were needed to cater for those who had been infected. Of course, because of the so many numbers involved in this COVID pandemic, we had inadequate health personnel. Within the Kenya prisons, we have both uniformed and uniformed members of staff in the medical section, but they were not adequate enough to cater for the so many numbers that were being infected at that time. And of course, the challenge of infrastructure. We are talking of virtual courts. For you to have virtual courts, you must have this electronic equipment, you must have internet, and then in some places, like maybe in the rural areas, you may not have electricity. And so it was a big challenge, and most definitely justice was delayed in some cases. And then, when movement is curtailed, and then it means it has a very negative impact on rehabilitation programs, because some of the training equipment will not be coming into the prisons. Some of the trainers we rely on come from outside. They were not supposed to come to the prisons. And also because of the isolation and people keeping distance, it was not very possible for prisoners to go to the workshops, to attend the trainings there, and so on. And as I said before, also the negative impact on the integration. Normally the visitation really helps in the reintegration of the prisoners, because they keep in touch with their society, they keep in touch with their family members. But staying so long, I think we stayed for close to over 1 year without visitation, with the prisoners being visited by their family members. You become a stranger to your people. And so when these guys get released, it becomes a problem to be reintegrated back into society. So that is one of the negative impacts of COVID-19. In terms of lessons learned, we are saying that as an organization, as Kenya Prison Service, we need to be prepared as an organization, because in many cases, prisons tend to rely on partners for support. But during COVID-19, we realized that even our partners were really hard hit, and therefore everybody was in a crisis. So you are crying for somebody to assist, and that person is also facing their own challenges wherever they are. And so we really need to try and catch up and develop our own preparedness as an organization. And we can do this through investment in infrastructure, human resource, and in equipment. Like I said, virtual courts, we need to have the equipment, we need to have the internet, telecommunication, we need to have those telephones that are enough for the prisoners to keep in touch with their families as often as they wish to. And then, of course, in terms of rehabilitation programs, having online classes and so on and so forth. And then finally, the greatest lesson we've learned from this COVID-19 is that we still can function without physical meeting, just like we are doing now. We are able to have this meeting and everybody separately wherever they are. And therefore, once we've put all this infrastructure in place, all the systems working, then we don't necessarily have to have people meeting physically for things to work. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Doctor. And I think the lesson learnt as the overall theme of kind of humane procedures, even though there needed to be restrictions, of course, that, you know, every prison globally introduced almost. Our good governance guide that I mentioned before that included Kenya, one thing that resounded with me was how there was this broader national framework adopted, but then there could be a more localized approach by each region and each local district. So your court users committees, for example, could adapt the kind of overall broader framework with local level actions to make sure that the particular context could be responded to. And that's something that we've highlighted in our guide as one of the sort of key decision-making structures and governance structures that enabled you to be effective and definitely in decongestion and releasing people from prison at the start of the pandemic. Right, I will now move on to a couple of remarks that are going to be made. One by our co-organiser, Brigitte Bouchard, who's the Acting Deputy Commissioner for Women at Correctional Service Canada, who's going to give some special remarks. And following that, Florence from Prison Insider will also add some remarks. So over to you.
Good day, everyone. Thank you for having me. Today, I'm just going to try and be brief because I know we're over time, but I think it's important to have a perspective about women and the vulnerability of the population that are more vulnerable within our prison system. So, Group of Friends of Corrections, for those who know the group, asked Canada to develop a training, a gender responsive training, to make sure that corrections around the world were taking into consideration the specific needs of women and more importantly, those that are in the criminal justice system that are more vulnerable and more impacted by incarceration due to their social role, like they're often mother and caregiver. So there's a lot of things to consider when we think at women in prison. So we took the challenge and we developed a training. Mainly what we looked at was the Penal Reform International training on the bank accruals. And what we did is looking from that end and trying to make it more operationalized approach for correctional staff to be able to implement easily the bank accruals, as well, because the training is very practical, like it's a 3-day training, and we're looking at from start going through all the bank accruals, the 1325 resolution on hiring practices and diversity. And it's moving on the 3rd day by applicable strategies in the prison. So by the 3rd day, people that are participating into the training are actually leaving with some sort of an action plan to put in place. So it makes it very concrete for them. And it's all about making sure that our prison system is adapted for women. So taking into consideration the integrity and the vulnerability of the women, making sure that they are in a safe environment so they can actually learn new skills and becoming productive citizen, making sure that they can actually attend their responsibilities in the community. So it really looks at alternatives to incarceration, as well as the needs of the women and in all the aspects of the women. So in that sense, it's a holistic approach that we're trying to implement. And since the inception of the program in 2015, we were able to train over 100 people. What's really resonate with me when I looked at those people is that not only they learned skills, they learned ways of addressing the needs of those women offenders, but the program also impacted their own lives and opened the sensitivity about women's corrections and the awareness about the women's need had significantly changed by this program. So I'll leave it with this. It's really like in a peacekeeping humanitarian environment that we're providing the training. However, I know that when we delivered in Canada to our own people, they took away great things from that training, and people are usually surprised by the level of details that we need to take into account. Even the way of addressing a woman, not for her to feel threatened or to feel welcome, makes a huge difference in our prison environment. So if there's questions, I will be available after. Thank you.
Thank you, Brigitte, for raising the different impacts and the different needs that we need to consider for women, especially in crises where often gender-based discrimination is exacerbated. Florence, I turn to you for a minute, and then we will have to move to closing remarks. But please, anybody who has a direct question, please put it in the Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Olivia. Thank you to the entire team at PRA and to all the co-sponsors. I'm very proud as Director of Prison Insider to be co-hosting this session. In a sentence, Prison Insider is an information platform about prisons in the world. Our work is to produce, disseminate information, testimonials, interviews, special reports, country profiles on prison conditions with a specific analysis about fundamental rights. And we publish all our material on our website in French, English, and Spanish. You're of course invited to go if you don't know our website yet. So much has been said already. I'm humbled to be after such a distinguished panel, and so much resonates with many of the findings that we've had at Prison Insider. Three very brief points that I find particularly interesting and resonating with the subject today. First, I think it's been noted that the obligation to protect prisoners is often coming as a second priority when faced with one of these of the triple threats. What we've seen when we examined the management of COVID showed that throughout the world, security priorities instead of protection took precedence in the crisis, and this had an impact on the guarantees of prisoners' rights. 2 years later, as has been said, the restrictive measures are still in place, and this has very harmful consequences on the dignity of prisoners and on the rehabilitation and the prison conditions in general. So I think one recommendation quite clearly is that security must not override rights and that they can go hand in hand. Second brief point, which I find relevant, is that the existing standards that we're used to working with, in particular the Nelson Mandela rules, but not only the Bangkok standards, etc., in our understanding, do provide very good guidance, and do give some keys for the preparedness, even though they're not specifically written for crisis. Our understanding was that during the COVID pandemic, if many more of the recommendations recommendations and the standards of the Nelson Mandela rules had been implemented, then many of the shortcomings would not have been the same. So I think this is an interesting connection between times of crisis and regular times. Last, I think a concern is that of transparency, and our friend Dimitro has made a very strong point about that. When a crisis happens, the opacity of prison systems tends to get even darker, and information does not come out. Our understanding at Prison Insider is that it is, especially in those times, more crucial to make sure the information gets out and also comes into prisoners, of course. This has a very crucial role for monitoring and has a preventive role, because we all know that when bars are closed, when doors are closed and no one knows, that's when the worst atrocities can happen and can go unnoticed. So my call would be to work hand in hand to make sure that prison conditions are documented, that everyone promotes transparency, and this will really make sure that the efforts for prisoners' rights can be built on the basis of such evidence. Thank you, Olivia.
Thank you, Florence, for almost wrapping up our event, which I think you made some very good points, especially around the applicability of international standards in no matter what context. Okay, so unfortunately, we do have to move to closing remarks. So I'm very pleased that our colleague from the Office for Foreign Affairs Liechtenstein is here, Karen Ling, who is the head of Unit for Security and Human Rights. Thank you so much for your support, Karen, in prison reform as well. And please go ahead for closing remarks.
Thank you, Olivia. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I try to be brief. It is a real pleasure to be here with you, and it was a pleasure to listening to all the presentations of the panelists. Liechtenstein, as you said, is a partner of PRI, and we commend you, dear Olivia, for moderating that rich and inspiring side event on the margins of the Crime Commission. For us, the meetings of the CCPCJ, these side events, serve as an important platform to discuss the interlinkages between criminal justice and human rights. So I wish to thank all panelists and participants for their insights and important comments today. Thanks to your active participation, we addressed many aspects of prison's crisis responses. Personally, I was very touched by all presentations and also by the views shared by Dmitry Yoganov on Ukraine. Let me be very clear, Liechtenstein condemns the Russian aggression against Ukraine in the strongest terms. The war has led to a catastrophic humanitarian situation and to enormous suffering, and we hope with you that that will end as soon as possible. Ladies and gentlemen, one key takeaway of today's event is that the onset of a crisis of any kind exposes weaknesses in government institutions. Unfortunately, criminal justice systems, courts, prisons, and other institutions are way too often stretched and underfunded, which in turn can further exacerbate the situation of those detained in crisis. Another major takeaway is that crises amplify existing inequalities. The conditions in which a crisis hits and the resources available for disaster response are fundamental to a government's ability to respond effectively. And of course, the political will to protect lives is equally important. Last but not least, any crisis preparation or response can only be effective when the rights of the most vulnerable are put front and center of our crisis response. In the same way, it is of critical importance to ensure good governance as well. Ladies and gentlemen, let me once again thank all of you for joining us today. We very much look forward to the continuation of our discussion. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Ling, and thank you to my panelists. It was really an insightful event, and I hope that it's planted some seeds in how we can move forward together as an international community, but also individually within our respective organisations and institutions. Thank you all for attending, and no doubt a very busy week at the Crime Commission. Yeah, share what we've put on social media as well about the comments, and we look forward to working with you all. Thank you very much.